Thank you for joining us today at the EquiLead Dialogues. Today we have Anindita Kundu with us, who is a queer neurodivergent psychotherapist. They are a certified trauma therapist from the Trauma Research Foundation, Boston, USA, certified integral somatic therapist from the Embody Lab, USA, and a certified queer affirmative therapist. In their therapy work, they use existential, feminist, intersectional disability justice framework. They use an eclectic approach integrating narrative techniques, IFS, DBT, body and somatic experiencing work within a social and disability justice framework. They work largely with folks navigating various forms of systemic oppression based on gender, sexuality, and political social justice, folks with trauma experiences, disabilities, neurodivergence, and chronic pain. Central to their practice is their lived experience of neurodivergence, autism and ADHD, queer identity, disability, chronic illnesses, chronic pain, and trauma. They have been featured and published in various newspapers over the years for their work. When they are not working, they are spending time with dogs. Welcome, Anindita. It's lovely to have you today with us. Today, in this conversation, we are going to talk about gender, disability, and equitable workplaces. So, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me today.
So, today we are going to have a conversation on disability, gender, and equity. What does that look like at the workplace? How do these multiple intersections work? With that said, let's jump right into the conversation. So, Anandita, given the theme of this evening's chat is disability, gender, and equitable workplaces, what is that one myth that you would like to bust regarding what works and what doesn't in this space?
Firstly, I would like to take the opportunity to thank you so much for having me today for this talk. It's a very it's a topic that's very close to my heart. I am somebody who is disabled, who is autistic. I live with multiple chronic illnesses, and I am somebody who is also queer. So these are intersections that I like to talk about, and what are the difficulties and unique struggles of being on those intersections. Right? One myth. I don't know about a myth, but I think one of the biggest narratives that we need to bust in the DEI space is that it's 21st century and DEI is not a problem anymore. Like, we have spaces, we have companies, there are policies that are that under the segment of DEI that are completely inclusive and that have and it's not something that we need to focus anymore on, because we had a good decade of focusing on it. I think that's one of the biggest narratives that we need to break from, because a big part of that narrative is the problem that we're talking about. That how do we make workplaces more equitable? How do we make workplaces that are diverse? Yes, which is a huge part of the hiring process, but they are also inclusive, which is what happens within your organization. So I think one of the biggest points that we need to talk about is like, hey, yes, it's 21st century, and yes, we have made a huge amount of progress in the DEI space, but there's still a lot to do, right? And especially with regards to disabled inclusion, there is a lot to do in that front. The huge amount of progress that has happened, it's primarily happened on racial fronts, on gender inclusivity, on sexuality inclusivity, right? But the one part that has consistently been overlooked in DEI is disabled inclusivity. Where are policies, where are spaces that actually include disabled folks? I think that's a huge part of it. I don't know if it's a myth, but it's definitely a narrative that I have come across consistently in my work and in my work with organizations.
No, definitely. I mean, as a disabled person myself, this feeling of isolation is always there. This feeling of being disconnected and not being able to share, because what if people think, I am not capable enough, is a fear that is always there. I mean, I'm someone who can only probably go out once in a month unless I really have to, because it's that overwhelming for me, right? So yeah, it's definitely not talked about enough, but because that's a great segue as well. According to you, what are some of those unique challenges faced by individuals with disabilities, mental health concerns, and diverse gender identities in navigating the workplace? In your experience, what have you observed?
Yeah, I think I'll piggyback on something that you said, right? You said that as a disabled person, people might see me lesser. That in itself gives us an understanding of how do we feel as disabled people in the workforce. Right? What the generic narrative, what the normative narrative is around disabled folks. I will come to the intersections in a bit, but I want to club two of the identities that you asked about, primarily the identities of disabled folks and mental health concerns. Right? I think a very big part of the discussion needs to move from the fact that disability is not what is at the face of it alone, which is physical disabilities. Physical disabilities, yes, are something that are visible. Visible disabilities are something that we are able to still somewhere make sense of, right? I am not saying there are inclusive policies about visible disabilities either. However, mental health concerns, emotional difficulties, psychological difficulties, learning disabilities, developmental disabilities, these are all huge part of chronic illnesses. These are all invisible to the naked eye. And that is never a part of the discussion, that how do we make environments of our workspaces inclusive for the 96% of the population all over the world who do identify disabled. Under the disability justice framework, one of the things that we talk about is that disability is not just what is visible to you. A huge part of it is also people who are living with mental health conditions, people who are living with chronic depression, chronic anxiety, people who are living with bipolar disorders, people who are living with OCDs. These are all mental health conditions. People who are living with people who are autistic, people who have ADHD. We don't consider these aspects. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, one of the things is when we talk about autistic identities, and when we talk about just going to some of the numbers, right? 1 in 10 people identify as autistic, which means if you know 10 people, you know one person who's autistic. Now, if I have to look at it from the workforce perspective, how many of us are actually talking about our autistic experiences in workforce? Which means how many of our colleagues know that we are autistic? How many of our colleagues are actually, how many times are we looking at the environment? Is it something that works for autistic people? We don't. 1 in 3 people have mental health conditions. 1 in 3 people live with mental health difficulties, challenges, which means that there are people right in the workforce who aren't feeling safe enough to talk about it. And I think the first step, when you ask me what is it that companies can do, or what is it that organizations can do to make make it more equitable, to make workplaces more equitable. When we talk about disabled identities, a big part of that equity is to first create safe spaces. Even before creating safe spaces, I think the first and the foremost point is to truly agree that there is a crack in the system. And the crack is that people with disabilities are consistently, disabled folks are consistently left behind from the workforce. We see and hear some people, some organizations worldwide, statistically, only 4% of organizations have disabled folks on their team. Where are the rest? A huge part of it is to first recognize that there is a crack in the system. If we don't recognize that, I don't know how we can bring positive changes. Another big part of it, I think this is, and this is coming from my experiences in the workforce, my experiences as a therapist when I'm working with other companies, when I'm working with other organizations, when I'm working with individuals. There is this understanding, oh, how do I work with somebody who's disabled? I don't know what they need. As a manager, how do I work with somebody who's disabled? What do they need? It got me thinking about the lack of understanding and the lack of awareness about disabilities and how we can create an environment that is inclusive of disabled folks. So the fear and the discomfort that I'm feeling as a manager is a very valid discomfort because I do not have enough training or information about it. Which means if I'm a hiring manager, will I hire the person who's disabled when I'm feeling so uncomfortable that I might completely do this wrong? So again, training, I feel, is a big part of it. I feel that that would be another aspect to talk about, that hey, how do we train? Yes, there are policies that we need to put in place, but how do we also train managers to have these difficult conversations, to sit with that discomfort, that yes, your discomfort isn't about the other's disability, it's about your inability to understand what the other needs, your inability, or you walking around eggshells, which is not what disabled people need. So that training element is a big part of the. I think it's a big step in making a positive change. But that can never happen if we don't have safe spaces. If we don't have safe spaces for people to tell that, hey, I don't know how to do this, but I would like to know how to do this. I would like to welcome a person who's disabled. I would like to make sure that my organization is inclusive, is equitable, right? How do I do this? Where do they go? This brings me to the point of representation. Most of the DEI programs are not run by people who are disabled, are not run by people who are queer, are not run by, some of them are. And yes, there might be one person or two people on the group or the panel or the team that who is a disabled person, but every organization, and we know this through how organizational psychology works, it's a trickle down effect from the top bottom. It's a top down effect. It cannot be a bottom up effect. Like, you cannot expect that one disabled person to make all of the change in the system. It needs to be a top down effect. Where is the representation? Most DEI spaces that I come across are not run by people who are disabled, are not run by people who are autistic. These programs that are built, they are built with an ableist gaze, that is built with a heteronormative gaze of what they might need. Why assume? What would it mean to have people on the margin on your panel? What would it mean to have people on the margin in your policy making discussions? What would it mean to have, like, if I'm making a policy for autistic folks, what would it mean for me to actually talk to autistic folks that, hey, how can we create this environment more inclusive for you? Right? And again, the question would be like, oh, then how do we include all forms of disability? You can have a person who is an expert in the disability space to actually talk you through different forms of disabilities. You can have one person on the intersection of every marginal identity. And by every marginal identity, I mean that if my positionality is that I'm an upper caste Hindu in India. If I am to talk about Dalit community, if I am to talk about caste inclusivity, I'm not the right person to talk about it. It's not my prerogative to take that space. What would it mean for me? When I talk about representation, I'm always talking about what would it mean for me to amplify the voices of people and pass the mic on when I don't really need to hold it anymore. I think that's where the top down effect, that is where, like, if we don't see that there's a crack in the system, we will never move towards understanding how do we fix that crack. And yes, I mean, I'm very aware I was talking primarily about disabled identities, but I'm also talking about that identity from the lens that has consistently historically been out of discussions. When we talk about DEI, we still do talk about gender equality. We still do talk about accessibility to people of different genders. We talk about sexuality inclusivity, but we still don't talk about disability inclusivity. And I think a big part of it is also to recognize that as a society, we view that, oh, disabled folks need a lot more than people who are able bodied, which means, am I willing to take all of these efforts? But the part that organizations tend to forget is that through all of the research that has been conducted in this space, it's always seen that whenever there is disability inclusivity and whenever there is diversity in an organization, their revenues generally go up 90%, which means you are losing out on a huge talent pool because you're not willing to take that step. So yeah, I think, of course, there are various other things that organizations can also do, right? But a big part of it is to check in with yourself that, hey, why are there less disabled folks in my organization? Is there something to do with my policies? Can I have it on the policy? Why are there why are people why do I not know anybody in my organization who's autistic? Why do I not know anybody in my organization who's having a mental health condition or a mental health? What do they need? What kind of work environment do they need? Now, when we talk about it, that 96% of the population worldwide live with some form of a disability, visible or invisible. If you make environments disability inclusive, you're literally people really don't need to open up about their disabilities. That is their personal choice. But you're making it inclusive for everybody there, not just one person. But we view it as if, oh, we have to change all of this for this one person. Yeah.
No, I absolutely agree on that front because when disability comes into the picture, I think a lot of the time clashes of lived experiences also happen, right? And when people are not aware about it, they don't know how to navigate it, or like how to make a safe space for everyone. How do we address everything? Some people might be comfortable sharing, some people might not be, some might have to share it so as to be able to do the work. For some it might not even be a choice, it's a matter of like financial stability, that you have to disclose it in order to get the accommodations, because disability also affects people differently. For some it might be important, like again we talk about rest and disability justice, which is very right and we should be talking about it, but there is also another chunk of us, and I also sometimes do that a lot of the times, that I have to keep working in order to not crash, right? Being autistic also means that like I have otherwise I'll crash completely and will be completely overthrown by my intrusive thoughts and won't be able to. So it's different, and not to assume things about disabled people. How to make it work for everyone else is something shouldn't be put on the disabled person or people who are there in the workforce. How do we make a system which works for everyone, is something that people, organizational leaders, institutions need to think about, sit through that discomfort to think through things, because it's people who have the resources also, no, because a lot of us are running on like very low spoons. So if people have those resources in order to brainstorm about those things, those are some of the positive ways of using a privilege as well. So that definitely brings me to my next question. We talked a bit about it, like we touched upon a few points that you shared. But according to you, what are some very specific things that workplaces can do to better accommodate individuals with disabilities, whilst also, addressing these intersectional challenges faced by those who identify with, marginalized identities?
Uh, I think before I answer the question, I would definitely like to add to something that you said. Like, when people can brainstorm and come up with solutions, come up with, oh, we need more disabled people. Why are they not a part of the workforce, right? What are the hindrances? I think a big part of that is to, yes, sit with that discomfort that comes up in you when you witness somebody else's disability. That's a big part of it. And the only way to do that is to have those compassionate conversations. What do I not know about this space? And I am using I as as an entity. Like, when it's an organization, what do we not know about this space? What is there to learn? To have that compassionate conversation is a big part of that first step. The brainstorming can only come when we are able to have those compassionate conversations with each other. What specific things can organizations do? I think a big part of it is hire somebody who's an expert. Hire an expert with lived experience. Don't go ahead and hire somebody who is an expert but not have the lived experience of being queer, of being disabled, of being of various intersections of marginal identities. Right? Hire somebody who has the lived experience of those. Hire them, talk to them, take their help, take their expertise, take their lived experience, and look into how can we build a plan that is more inclusive. Like I said, rework what is the disability panel in my organization like? What is the DEI panel in my organization like? It can't be a, I think one of the things that we often, it's also something that comes from a well-meaning oversight, right? By well-meaning oversight, I mean that we do not see, if you are noticing that you are, it was an oversight that, oh, we booked a space for an event, but it's not accessible by disabled folks. Is it a well-meaning oversight? Yeah, you didn't intend to do this, but the mere fact that you did not think about it is what is inclusivity. So much of inclusivity is like, oh, it was just an oversight, but the mere fact that you didn't think about it is the heteronormative ableist gaze to what is needed. This is where I was like, it's really important. When I work with organizations, I talk to them about the fact that it's so deeply important that you need people with lived experience on your policy making panel, on your policy making meetings, to be able to talk to you about, hey, no, this is not what we need. What we need is this. And that's a huge step to, how can we begin? What is the step one? How can we begin? A huge part of the other aspects is create safe spaces, like you said, right? That sometimes it is a choice that we do not have to open up about our disabilities. But my question to organizations and the world in general is it safe enough for me to open up about my disability? If it isn't safe enough, only then do we not want to open up about our disability. Why wouldn't I want to open up about something that is such a huge part of who I am? it is something that I am navigating the world with. Sometimes we don't have a choice. Like if somebody is wheelchair bound, they don't have a choice. Right? That, but to actually talk about their disability. If somebody has a mobility issue, if somebody has a motor difficulty, they don't have a choice. People with invisible disabilities, do we feel safe enough often to talk about it? It's not like we don't want to talk about it, but there are less and less safe spaces to be able to talk about it. Like if I open up to my organization or to my HR or to people who I'm working with that I'm autistic, will they see me differently? Will they not include me in spaces? Will they not? Will they think I'm lesser? These questions that arise, it is a marker of the society society at broader term and the organization culture that I'm living with, that I am navigating every single day. If I have an organizational culture where I'm like, yes, people are autistic and they are equal to everybody else, right? We have we have the sensory needs of autistic people in mind. We have the accessibility need of people who have motor difficulties in mind, right? That's how we have designed our office. Would I not feel safe enough to talk about it? We often either feel unsafe to talk about our disabled identities, to talk about our queer identities, to talk about our mental health difficulties. Because if I reveal that I'm living with chronic depression, I have felt that as a mental health professional as well. Even though I don't work within an organizational setup, I felt that if I open up about my autism, will others feel that I'm lesser as a therapist? That, oh, they're autistic, which means will they understand my emotions? Will they understand my difficulties? Right? Considering they're autistic, because we have a biased idea. So the part that we need to question, and it is going to be an uncomfortable questioning. It's not going to be an easy questioning. The part that we need to question as organizations, as managers, as leaders of organizations is, what are my unconscious bias? Whether it is towards queer people, whether it is towards trans people, whether it is towards non-binary folks, whether it is towards people with mental health conditions, or whether it is towards disabled folks. What are my unconscious bias? And more often than not, the unconscious bias that I've consistently been seeing is that, oh, the whole focus will only go on DEI, and we won't have, we'll need talent pool. DEI can be a part of the talent pool because people from all identities are talented. People from marginal identities are also deeply talented. We think that, oh, a big part of that discomfort and that unconscious bias is, yeah, disabled folks may not be able to perform at the same level as people who are not disabled. Again, something that isn't true by any means. If given the right environment, disabled folks can perform at the level that and the capacity that they have, like any other human being. Nobody should be performing at a 20-hour work day level that is not inclusive to any human being. So then my question often is that, is it the policies, or is it us as people who live with our unconscious biases, who do not question our unconscious biases, and that's where the cracks are. If the leaders of the organizations question these, we can take concrete steps that, okay, let's create safe spaces for people of different identities. We can have queer groups in the organization. We can have trans groups in the organization. Trans folks don't get as much employability when they do come out as trans people or when they are transitioning. they don't get as much employability. I remember, without taking names, I was working in this organization, and a colleague of mine, uh, they were trans, and they spoke about the fact that, hey, I'm transitioning. How do I talk to the management about it? And the management was like, no, the top management was like, you cannot transition. This was the comment, that you cannot transition. And I'm like, that's not yours to say whether somebody can transition or not. Oh, if you transition, it's going to have a lot of impact on people around you, and there will be so many things that we'll have to figure out. And I'm like, that's none of the person's business. That's your policies that are not in place. Having said that, of course, like, they transitioned, and we had a huge showdown in the organization and all of that. But my point that I was trying to make from that story, that little story, is that when we talk about gender inclusivity, are we only talking about cisgender inclusivity? Are we only talking about men and women? Are we not talking about trans people? Are we not talking about non-binary people? Are we not talking about their gender fluid people? Are we not talking about agender people and their right to express themselves and their gender identities within a workplace? Those are not in most policies. And the employability rate is massively impacted because they are not in policies. Because when we are talking about gender inclusivity, we are only and only talking about cisgenders. A huge part of this is people do not talk about their mental health conditions. People don't talk about the fact that they have depressive episodes. Someone's having a panic attack. My first 4 years of my work was in an EAP setup, which is an employee assistance program. And this organization that I used to work with, that would work with different organizations, where we were providing counseling services to the employees of these organizations. The number of calls that we were receiving on an everyday basis, where people are struggling with their mental health conditions, but cannot open up to their managers, cannot open up to their peers, cannot talk about this at workplace, have been treated badly when they've spoken about this at their workplaces, have been ostracized by the entire team because they have a mental health condition, because they are struggling with something that is human. That got me thinking very deeply about, even at the policy level, do we just have it on paper? Where is the execution of it? Most of the organizations have DEI policies and have them on paper, yes. But very few of them actually go ahead and implement it and make sure that there is accountability in implementing it. And how do we create that accountability? By making sure that there is a team of people who are experts in these areas and who have lived experience in these areas, who are going to be making sure that there is accountability to the policies that should be implemented, and they are not just policies on paper. And I think that's a big part of it. That's a huge part of it. Most organizations don't have these spaces. They have DEI policies, and I know that a lot of my friends and colleagues have been hired who are also autistic, have been hired by big companies, right? Like the big fours and all. They've been hired from their DEI program, but they don't know what to do next. You hire an autistic person and you have no idea of how to work with an autistic person, how to accommodate the autistic person's need. You have no idea. You've hired an autistic person, and it's like, you don't know swimming, I'm going to throw you into the pool and I'm going to expect that you swim. But you have no idea how to swim, and me as a coach, I have no idea how to help you. And that's how the DEI landscape at the moment is. People who are heading it, they need to have more lived experience experts who can actually drive these policies into action, who can look into the cracks of these policies and talk about it from a compassionate perspective that, hey, these are the cracks, this is what is going to happen if these cracks stay. If you are hiring an autistic person, let's make the environment more sensorily manageable for the autistic person. Let them use their sensory aids and not something that should be like, oh, you can't use all of these in the office. That's not how it should be. Let's put in place the aspect of work from home, something that is accessible to most people who are disabled. One of the, again, I'm going to numbers, right? The employability rate of disabled folks increased drastically during COVID, and the moment that COVID lockdowns lifted, it's like people completely forgot that there are also a huge segment of population that's disabled. And when I say disabled, I'm talking about people who are fighting social injustices, I'm talking about people who are struggling with systems, I'm talking about people who are queer and have mental health difficulties, I'm talking about people who have mental health conditions, I'm talking about people with chronic illnesses, and I'm talking about people with physical disabilities. I'm just using a term, disabled, which doesn't just mean people who have physical disabilities. The employability rate increased drastically during COVID, and the moment the lockdown lifted, it's again gone down drastically because the workplaces aren't accessible. So I think those are few like, to sum it up, because I think I went on a monologue. To sum it up, compassionate conversations, uncomfortable conversations, hiring experts who have lived experience of being queer, of being at the intersections of marginal identities, who can actually help drive the policies into action, holding teams accountable, and having expert training for your leadership management to learn how to work with people from various different marginalized identities, how to work with disabled folks, how to work with autistic people, how to work with queer people, how to work with trans people, how their gender expression can be a big part of the diversity in your own organization. And the last point that I said, that expert training for the leadership teams, the management of a company, that is what is going to create the trickle-down effect. And this has to be looked not in silos of, oh, great, I am going to create a DEI. DEI is important, I'm going to look into only racial diversity or only gender equity. And when I'm looking at gender equity, I'm only going to look at cisgender experiences. It can't be looked into as silos. It has to be a broader understanding of what inclusion looks like, which would be at various levels. And a big part of that is disabled inclusion. Disabled inclusion, if you are finding that in your organization there aren't, or people aren't talking about their disabilities, or there aren't people with physical disabilities, there aren't people with motor issues, there aren't people who are autistic, then you're doing something really wrong, which means your policies are overlooking, or there is a huge oversight in your policies in your hiring process for people with disabilities. That's what it has to be looked into from a bigger perspective, from a broader perspective at different various levels. That how can we train managers of different levels? How can we train peers of how to make a person who is disabled, who is trans, who may be living at multiple marginal identities, at the intersections of multiple marginal identities, how do we make them feel welcomed in our organization? And it's not just, let's not just tolerate it. Yeah, okay, DEI hai to hai. Like, let's not just tolerate that it's something that just exists. And it has nothing to do with me because I'm able-bodied. It has everything to do with you because you're able-bodied. You have the avenue to make somebody who isn't feel welcome into a space that's primarily dominated by people who are able-bodied, people who are cis-het. So yeah, I think those are few steps that organizations can definitely look into.
You covered a lot of points, that until um other people, like everybody, the idea of creating a safe space is on the shoulders of everyone, not just the disabled person. The disabled person shouldn't have to, constantly say, okay, this is where, I'm feeling left out. This is where I'm being silenced, because people don't realize how silencing happens, even if unintentionally, I mean, I
Yeah,
would give that benefit of doubt as well. But it's there, and then clashes of lived experiences, lived realities happen as well. So how do we build that safe space together? Because even everybody has trauma, right? So acknowledging that, okay, I might navigate it differently, but that really hurts the person. That
yeah,
person is really getting isolated. So having those difficult conversations, and also, like you said, bridging the gap between policy and practice with firm kindness is something. Because otherwise, okay, first of all, policies are not there. If policies are there also, because we come with such complex identities, especially in the social justice space, just so much trauma, and you know especially disabled people. Sorry.
there are so many layers to it.
Exactly. So how do we deal with it with firm kindness, accountability, but with firm kindness? Because otherwise, um people sort of shy away from, like, holding that accountability as well. And then the person who is harmed with the original harm, it's never addressed, and it's just like you just brush it off, and then it's very it becomes very difficult, because that harm is never addressed, and you just keep walking around eggshells, which is not very inclusive, and everybody sort of like ends up feeling isolated. So that's why it's important to have that expert who can come and facilitate and hold that space
Yeah,
with care, and everything. So, but that said, I want to move on to the final question that I had for you, Anandita. So what is that one factor that you deem was critical to your professional growth, given all the identities that you come with?
uh, I think leaving an organization was a very critical point for my professional growth. I left an organization when I was 4 years into my career, and after which I started my own practice. That has been a huge learning curve because that gave me space to reflect on how I want, if I were, which I'm looking into, like if I am to build an organization for other therapists, for therapists who are disabled, for therapists who are neurodivergent, for therapists who are chronically ill, the mental health space, the mental health system is also very deeply ableist and rooted in colonial hangover. Having said that, I'm very cognizant that as a disabled therapist, as a as a queer therapist, I've often constantly, as a chronically ill therapist, I've often constantly questioned this idea of consistency that that we are constantly taught about, especially as a therapist. That idea of consistency, that oh, I have to be my 100% every time that I show up, without ever understanding what goes in the background of it. When I say the mental health space, the mental health system is extremely ableist, I mean about it from the perspective that, and this is not just my experience, multiple therapists who I mentor, they also experience the same thing, that, hey, why is it that where is my space as a therapist who's disabled? How do I access the system safely, where I can also open up about my disability, where I can also bring my entirety into existence than looking at therapists as these perfect beings who are not human, like who you just go to and they have no emotion and no feelings and no existence altogether. Again, there are look into the policies of the mental health system altogether. And when I say policies, I'm primarily questioning the layout, that this is what therapists are supposed to do, this is what therapists are supposed to ask. These are policies that are laid out for therapists who are practicing. They do not have anything that include autistic therapists. They do not have anything that include disabled therapists. They do not have anything, any policies of inclusion for queer therapists, that, hey, I can talk about my queer identity to my client because that is my existence and that is my being. That does not mean that the entire focus is on me. So I think a big part of my, before I digress completely into another aspect, I think a big part of my professional growth, and I don't consider it a growth yet because I feel like there is so much more that is to learn in this space for me. I think I've met people who have always believed in me, whether it be, and those are my affirmative experiences. And I think for any person in the intersections of the marginalized identities, having affirmative experiences from colleagues, from friends, from partners, from managers, from people in your organization, having those affirmative experiences can be very therapeutic and can be very wholesome in your growth as a person and in your professional growth. If I'm struggling with mental health conditions, which I have, and I still do, if I'm struggling and I have someone else breathing down my neck and telling me what is wrong with you, rather than understanding what is happening with you, these are two completely different approaches. One is an affirmative experience, and the other is, I don't care, just figure it out. I think those affirmative experiences are very, very crucial for anybody's growth in a space. And I'm really glad that you brought up trauma, that people have different experiences with trauma and different ways of dealing with trauma. One of the things that we learned in our trauma training is that I don't get to decide what is traumatizing for you. Even if I'm your therapist, I cannot say that, oh, this is traumatizing for you, or no, this is not trauma. It's not mine to decide because it's personal. Similarly, if we take the same thing and use it in the DEI space, why do cis-het, able-bodied, upper caste people get to decide what is important for people who are disabled, what is important for people who are queer, what is important for people who are struggling with mental health conditions, what is important to have for Dalit communities, what is important to have for DBA communities, how do we bring that inclusivity in? It's not ours to decide, which is where I think I'll come back to the point that pass on the mic to people who are living in those margins. And just one last part that I would add to that is there is this concept called the charmed circle. The charmed circle is this, the way I imagine it is like, imagine concentric circles, right? The innermost circle is where all of the power exists in a society. And this charmed circle can be used in any organization to understand the policies and the modalities of their organization. The innermost circle is where all of the power lies. If I was to view it from the societal perspective, a cis-het Brahmin man in Indian context would be at the center, bang center of that circle, and has all of the power. Everybody else falls somewhere outside of that innermost circle, somewhere on the concentric circle. For a lot of people, they fall at the margins, the outermost margins. This helps us understand that privilege is a spectrum. And the way that we can use this in order to understand the DI landscape is Why do we not go to the margins? It is uncomfortable to leave that position of power and go to the margins and look into what is really needed in the space of the margins. How do I bring people from the margins closer to the innermost circle? That is a it's a very uncomfortable experience to go through, because of course I enjoy all of the privileges that comes with me being in power. That is true for human nature, which is also true for organizational spaces, which means the journey from the innermost circle to the outermost spaces is a very difficult one. And when we say that, hey, we are committed to DEI, are we really willing to make that journey? What are those steps that we can take in order to actually make that journey? And what are those actionable steps? Then the question always falls is, am I willing to give up that power that comes in the entire team being able bodied or the entire team being cishet? And if the entire team is cishet, I really don't need to put myself through the discomfort of figuring out how do I use somebody's pronouns. At the base level, I'm talking that how do I use someone's pronouns? I'll just leave this thought there. This is not my original thought. It is a thought that I'm borrowing from somebody who is an activist and a writer and a speaker in this space called Alok Vedmenon. They say this thing where they say that comprehension isn't necessary for compassion. I don't need to know or understand why you use she, they in order to actually feel compassionate that that is your pronoun and I'm going to use that. So that's the discomfort, that we are always stuck on comprehension. How do we do this without the compassion? So yeah, that's just
This is a this is a lovely thought, because I don't feel misgendered when people use she for me. But when someone uses they, I feel very seen and heard.
yeah,
And this mostly happens in queer circles only, that somebody notices it and just uses they. And that's when I feel like, okay, I belong here. Otherwise, it's so binary out there. And sometimes I don't realize it, but sometimes when I have to fill out forms and I have to, it used to happen so because we're conditioned, right? It used to happen when I was a child, when growing up, but when these theories became also accessible to me, when I started learning, because otherwise I thought I'm a misfit, right? Why do I like women? Why do I like both men and women? Like, because my peers were always interested in men. Uh, that shame, living with that shame alone for a very long time. But getting access to those spaces, knowing that people see you, people hear you, was a big part, that affirmative part. That journey is, that experience is so important for some of us who have led such isolated lives. And yeah, I mean, you don't always have to understand why it hurts someone. If they
no,
say it hurts them,
it hurts.
yeah, it hurts. That's all. You can
That's
start
all
from there.
there is, to have compassion. That when you
Yeah.
say I believe, that is affirmative experiences, right? That I do not have to understand your experience completely or comprehend your experience completely to be able to have compassion for it. And like you said, when we have those affirmative experiences, we feel like we belong. And I think a big part of the whole agenda of having DEI is to make people feel that they belong. So
That's the addition that has happened, no, these days, DEIB now,
yeah,
right? But it's just become a term again.
yeah, yeah. And we get stuck on those terminologies without truly looking at, okay, what what is it that people need in order to feel that they belong?
No, this was such a validating conversation for me. Like, I could feel very seen and heard through this conversation, and I hope people who are watching this also, and who will watch this later on also, will feel that sense of belongingness in these spaces, because these spaces of care are also important, which can't always be quantified which is something that happens in the social sector. Okay, this is the project, and these are the outcomes and everything. But sometimes these can't be quantified. But these circles of care are very important. So thank you so much for taking out the time to join us today. It was lovely having with you, talking to you, and I hope this sparks, some thoughts, some reflections among people who also listen to it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Thank
that's
you so
all.
much for having me today. It was a very, very warm conversation for me. And you've been such a lovely host. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Like, it was a pleasure having you. Thank you everyone who tuned in today.